Gary Littlejohn, actor, stuntman, custom motorcycle builder, and quite possibly one of the first people to produce a rigid BMX bike. Let's talk today about one of the most interesting people involved with the birth of BMX. Gary Littlejohn was born on January 5, 1946 in Ira, Vermont. After high school, he headed to California to attend Pierce College for Metallurgic Engineering and worked at Rocketdyne Aerospace as a welder. On the side, to earn a few extra bucks, Gary started doing some welding on motorcycles. He started making custom gas tanks, frames, and even completely custom motorcycles. The bikes grew in popularity, to say the least, and what started as a side job quickly turned into something much bigger. He was always on the cover of popular magazines with the oh-so-original titles of Motorcycle Magazine and, Chopper Magazine. Hollywood started taking notice. They wanted to start making a few motorcycle movies, and since Gary was always on the cover of these magazines, they called him up and asked for his help. The first movie Gary worked on was called The Wild Angels and starred Pete Fonda and was directed by none other than the king of low budget, Roger Corman. I can't deny, I do love a good Roger Corman movie.
You have wounded me, and I must grow a new claw.
Gary became friends with Peter Fonda, and this quickly led to more and more work in Hollywood. He became one of the go-to people for the motorcycle work in Hollywood. He would make the motorcycles, he would ride them in the films, he would help others learn to ride. He was essentially a one-stop shop for all things motorcycle related. Littlejohn even stated in one interview that I read that this actually started to hinder him in the Hollywood business. He really did want to do some acting, but a lot of times people would forego hiring him for anything other than motorcycle-related films because they thought he was actually in a gang like Hell's Angels or something like that. And he never was. He did deal with them because he was a custom motorcycle builder. But I just thought it was funny that he seemed rather, I don't know what the right word would be, let down that was the persona that a lot of people were taking from him. But either way, Gary ended up being in and helping with a slew of films. It started with smaller movies like Devil's Angels and Hell's Angels on Wheels, but he inevitably was in some bangers. Like he was the sheriff in Badlands by Terrence Malick, who is one of my favorite directors, and he has done well over 50 stunts for films. He helped on the 90s blockbuster Heat, he worked on The Mask, and finally he worked on the pinnacle of 70s motorcycle movies, Easy Rider. Which, side note, Gary thought that Easy Rider is one of the worst movies he has ever seen. He found it pretty funny. He claimed that the production was just very unorganized and the movie was completely unwatchable to him. He said that they had no vision of where they wanted to go with the movie. They were just filming scenes is what it seemed like. So he hated the movie. But he did say that the film came out at the perfect time and just took off like a rocket. Gary did state that the only good parts of the movie were the ones that had Jack Nicholson in it. There's so much information out there on him because he was involved with Hollywood and put into the Stuntman Hall of Fame. I could do a whole video on just his film career, but we have to stay on course. So Gary had his custom motorcycle shop that he could close down at any time and go to work on movies. It was the perfect setup. This kid came in with a Stingray he had broken racing this newfangled sport that wasn't even called BMX yet. Gary welded the frame back together, and a week later the kid was back with a crack in a different spot. Gary said, "Why don't I just make you a stronger frame?" The first Littlejohn frame was born in the late 60s, and when that kid couldn't break the new frame, more people flocked to Gary's motorcycle shop, and all of a sudden, he was in the BMX business. Again, this was late 60s. I can't confirm that Gary Littlejohn was the first ever BMX bike. Like, not a Stingray, not something modified for BMX, but in my head, I'm placing it there because it's the late 60s. Every other thing I've researched has been 70s, at least early 70s. But Gary stated that the first truly designed from scratch BMX bike by him was none other than the famous Monoshock that so many have copied. And like I've said before, the first BMX tracks were something akin to a downhill BMX track. People started complaining about the rigid frames being so squirrely, so Gary thought he would take his knowledge of motorcycles and apply it to bicycles. 2 shocks in the rear end would be just way too heavy, i.e. the Panda prototype that weighed 45 pounds. So he simply put a single monoshock in the rear. There's a great interview that I will link below with Gary Littlejohn, and he is pretty frank with his answers. When asked when did he stop making the monoshock, he stated that he never really did. The market just changed, and everyone wanted a standard rigid frame. Those first BMX bikes from Littlejohn were unique, though. He had nothing to copy and nothing to go off of. Gary was simply taking his knowledge of metallurgy, making these rigid frames strong where he felt they needed to be. If he had one that would break, he would tweak the design, rinse and repeat. But his strong frames got very popular. At the peak, they were producing 1,500 to 2,500 a week. I could also do an entire video on side hacks, but for purposes of this video, we're just gonna leave it as Gary was the first one to start producing side hacks. I'm gonna do an entire video on them, so just side hacks, put them in another basket, we'll get to them. And in 1969, Gary attended one of those bicycle trade shows we have discussed, and he brought along this newly popular bicycle motocross bike that he had been selling. The first bicycle show I ever went to, I was the only BMXer there. And they almost shunned me out of the thing because it was just 10-speed bikes and stuff like that. So they weren't really happy with what I was trying to do. So it was kind of funny because when I went down there, here I am by myself, and the Japanese come over and they saw that what I was doing and started taking pictures. And I brought a prototype that I had just threw together just to take to the show to show that we had something coming up, and they copied it exactly. And it was really junk. It wasn't tested or anything, and they made thousands of them. They brought them over here and they all busted, and that's what they get for copying. So as soon as I got back to the shop, I perfected it and got it going, and then I had my riders ride it for a while and test it. I never put anything on the track that wasn't tested, and tested hard. It is funny to me how similar Gary's experience at the trade show was to Panda's. Like, there were definitely more BMX brands at the shows in '72 when Panda was there, but BMX still wasn't accepted by the big companies yet. In the late '60s, early '70s, BMX was definitely like the redheaded stepchild of the cycling world. Except now, that redheaded stepchild is in the Olympics. Once Gary started producing a lot of frames, he was sending them to a company in San Francisco to be built into complete bikes. Skip Hess of Mongoose fame, who I did a video on a while ago, was sending his Moto Mags to this same company. Suffice it to say, things ended up not working out between Littlejohn and said company. Skip Hess actually took one of the Littlejohn frames from that company, had it copied, and that was the first Mongoose frame. Of course, this is all from an interview with Gary, but the timeline of events do add up, and Gary was never butthurt about it either. In interviews, he always said positive things about Skip. And at the same time Mongoose was getting off the ground, Gary Littlejohn had been in the business for a few years now, and he ended up coming out with one of the first uniformed BMX teams. It was somewhere around '71, I believe, which is hard to fathom given the true BMX explosion was still a couple years out. This was even prior to Panda's BMX team. I don't know if it was the first again, but it had to be one of the first. Now this is where things get even more interesting to me. Gary had a reputation for making strong frames, right? Well, like we have discussed in some of my earlier videos, before mountain bikes were a thing, people would ride cruisers down fire roads, and those were the first mountain bikes. Think of cruisers to mountain bikes like stingrays are to BMX. Well, at this point, I'll just let Gary tell you this part. They were bringing in frames that were broken, and I just said, you know, I can make a better mousetrap than that, so I just started making those, and they turned out really good. They were strong. So they started using those for downhill races, and at the time they were calling them bonsai runs. And the guys from Colorado started buying a bunch from me, and they started putting gears on them and using them for mountain bikes. And Gary even produced a bicycle specifically for this. It was the Littlejohn 26 Fire Road BMX bike, which that is friggin' awesome. So not only is Gary Littlejohn in the BMX Hall of Fame, he was producing some of the first mountain bike cruisers. I wouldn't call them a mountain bike yet, but he was just producing really strong frames for the people that kind of birthed the start of mountain bikes. So he kind of had his hands in all assets of cycling, which is freaking cool. And as the years rolled around through the mid to late '70s, Gary continued to adapt and honestly just make whatever people asked him to. And honestly, that's why he stopped making BMX bikes. People just stopped asking for them. As Gary puts it, everybody wanted to go to Taiwan and have them made over there, and I really didn't want to. I wanted an American-made product by Americans, so I held off, and they put me out of business. It was somewhere around 1986 that Gary Littlejohn would make his last bicycle. I don't think Gary Littlejohn was ever in the BMX business per se. He was in the creation business, and he just so happened to be around for the BMX boom. If he would have been born decades later, who knows? He might be a famous mountain bike frame builder, or centuries earlier, maybe he would have welded some of the first cars. Anyway, Gary closed up shop because he didn't want to be in that on the cutthroat business side of things. He just wanted to create stuff that people bought. Does that make sense? He didn't want to outsource stuff to Taiwan and then bring it over here and try to sell this product. He literally just wanted to make something, and if you wanted to buy it, he'd sell it to you. To me, this also goes along with his stunt work, which he continued to do for a couple decades after closing the BMX business. He was helping to create something. He helped create films. And I really respect Gary's story, and I'm sure he had a lot to tell. And Gary Littlejohn was inducted into the Stuntman Hall of Fame in 1992, and later in 1998, the BMX Hall of Fame. So that's what happened to Gary Littlejohn. He's one of the early founders of BMX that I would have loved to meet because he's very matter-of-fact about this stuff. He never seemed to talk of himself as a founder of BMX, even though he had a heavy influence on it. He was just like, yeah, I saw people breaking bicycles and I made better ones. That's all I did. I didn't found anything. I didn't make a new sport. I just welded. That's what he liked to do, and that's respectable. I like that. I'm also a huge film buff, so getting to go back and watch scenes and knowing that that's Gary Littlejohn, the guy that made some of the first BMX bikes, it was pretty cool. Let me know what you guys think. If you made it this far, please like and subscribe and share the videos. That always helps because, you know, these BMX videos don't get recommended by the algorithm sometimes. Let's keep moving along. Got some already plugged in and ready to record. I'll see you in the next one. Later.